Welcome all to the Service Children's Progression Alliance Year of the Service Child Voice Report interactive webinar. My name is Phil Dent. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event and delighted that so many people have found the time in these uncertain times to invest a little bit, just an hour and a half, in listening and talking a bit about listening. I'm just going to wait for a moment to allow others an opportunity just to log on. In the meantime, by all means, please use the chat function just to introduce yourselves to each other. And I'll give you some more instructions in a minute or two when we get going in earnest. Just another welcome to you if you missed my earlier hello. I'm Phil Dent, the Director of the Service Children's Progression Alliance, and it's my pleasure and thrill to welcome you to this webinar. As I said, as many people are, I can see the banter has already begun. Please do use the chat function just to connect with each other, get the best possible experience you can, given that this is happening in place of our postponed face-to-face conference, which we hope will happen on the 20th of October. You can find out more about that on our website. I'm really pleased to have got to this point after a whole year of thinking about listening, and today to share the findings of a report. I'm just going to take a little time to tell you how things are going to work this afternoon and introduce those of you who don't know as well to the Alliance itself. There will be opportunity for Q&A to the report author and also to the panel that we have, the practice panel, who are going to be sharing some of their experiences. We won't necessarily be able to respond to all of your questions on air, but we're going to do our best to respond after. There is, in fact, in the Q&A facility, I think for most of you, the option to vote. If someone else has already asked a question that essentially is your question, rather than asking it again and us having a list of 100, which would be great, you could just click a little thumbs up and say, yeah, that's the question I wanted answered. And then we'll know that a lot of people are waiting and keen on an answer to that question, and we'll focus our attention that way. Just a reminder as well, you should have known this, obviously read through lengthy privacy statements in advance. We're recording this, but you cannot be seen or heard. Any comments you make in the chat, we'll be able to use now and immediately after, just to be able to respond to the questions and the comments you're making. But again, they won't form part of the recording. And if you're one of those listening to us on YouTube Live, then you're obviously not engaged at all with the chat function. I appreciate we won't be able to monitor the comment function there as well as the chat function here. So hopefully you're happy that you've chosen that, because you just want to listen to us and look at our lovely faces. We will send out the recording then a short while after the event, as well as posting on the website links to the slides and of course to the report itself. Many of you I know are established allies in the Alliance already, but some of you I can see through the list of participants might well be new to us. So I'll take just a couple of moments to share with you a little bit about the Alliance before introducing to you essentially the reason why we undertook a year of the Service Child Voice. Armed Forces children have huge potential. This is something we've come to know very well, and those of you who've worked in this field for a long time know very, very well, but they're also at risk of underachieving. The complex interplay of separation from parents, one or both, of high levels of mobility, potentially between schools, between countries, and of the transition out of the military have a real complex interaction with each other that is unique to each child. And that can lead to discontinuity in their life journey, discontinuity in learning, discontinuity in relationships, and discontinuity in opportunities. And we have found that that is an opportunity for development. Much research has identified that this can lead to greater adaptability. It can afford service children with greater independence and maturity. But it also introduces the risk of disadvantage, because the service life is such a central feature of service families. Service children are less likely to go on to higher education. They may attain less well at GCSE if they move schools a lot, and they can experience all manner of social and emotional disruption, which impacts on their mental health and well-being. The Alliance exists to respond to that, to a vision of thriving lives for children. And the Alliance itself is a very small central team and a very large UK-wide and a little bit beyond UK network, which is why I'm so thrilled that so many people have been able to find time to join us today to represent the reality of the Alliance. Our response to that need, though, broadly speaking, is to support those who are helping service children to thrive. There are 4 themes about our activity. The overarching theme is the work that we do to enable good partnership. There are a huge range and diversity of people who have a stake in service children's education and in helping them to thrive. And our main focus is helping those people's collective knowledge to have a greater collective impact on service children's outcomes. But within that overarching theme of partnership, we're keen on 3 particular priorities. The first of those is practice. Our starting point, our end point, is wanting to enhance the practice. If we want service children's outcomes to improve, we have to do some things differently. And we're interested in working out, understanding better service children's lives so that we can do those things that will enable them better outcomes, that will be more effective. So to that end, we respond to the findings of our consultation in 2018, which broadly told us that practitioners, people, professionals with a stake in service children's education and journeys want to be better connected. They want to be better connected with each other. They want to be better connected with evidence, and they want to be better connected with support. And we do that through a range of ways, but principally and primarily, we connect people through our UK-wide hub network. If you're not a member of a hub, then go to the website and you can find out which hubs are operating and how to get engaged with them. But the hub network is also the best expression of what the Alliance means, because it is not led by the small central team that facilitate the Alliance's work. Those hubs are led by allies themselves, universities, charities, collaboratively in all of those parts of the UK, leading collaboration that's relevant to their local context, and feeding in the challenges that they face, the solutions that they come up with, and sharing the successes to a central practice group. So that whole network is the best expression of our response to the need to collaborate well. But those hubs are also not about practice, they're research practice hubs. And we're so grateful that a large number and diversity of researchers engage directly in those hubs, so that researchers and practitioners together are asking and answering the questions that will help us to understand service children's lives and needs better, and also know what works to improve their outcomes. Research is our second theme. We commission research, we undertake our own research, we collate the findings of other people's research, all with the goal of understanding service children's lives better and developing practice that will improve their outcomes. And finally, we engage in policy. We're interested in trying to help create a system that supports practitioners, that supports researchers, and ultimately supports service children to have successful lives. And that means policy makers being better informed by the evidence to remove barriers that there are in policy, as well as create a system that works for all of us. The result of all that, our hope is that the collective resource that we have as an alliance is used to better effect, that the practitioners themselves are able to be more confident and deliver life-changing support to service children, that research investment, collaboration, and the knowledge creation that results grows, and that better policy helps to grow the scale and the coherence of this work throughout that system. Our hope is that by doing that, by facilitating that collaboration and those outcomes, we will deliver thriving lives for service children. They can make confident and informed transitions through further and higher education into thriving lives. So if you didn't before, you certainly now know what the Service Children's Progression Alliance is about and why we exist, and broadly speaking, how we go about doing that. I think, though, in conclusion, if I have one message, in answer to the question, do you want to help service children? How do I help service children? Then the answer is simply to listen. And it was early in 2019 that Gilly Carell from the Army Families Federation called me, and we had a conversation around the question of what should be a focal point for our work for service children. And she had an idea, and I had an idea, and it turned out that it was the same idea. And that idea was that we need to and want to improve how we hear the voices of service children. And that was the inspiration for the Year of the Service Child Voice and for the report that we're launching today. We're going to hear very shortly from Dr. Michael Hall, who is a SCIP Alliance researcher and a lecturer and researcher at the University of Winchester, who's going to share the findings of the report in two parts. We're going to invite you to interact with some polls that get you thinking about some of the questions and opportunities that the findings raise, and then end with a practice panel which involves three people whose work is featured in the report and are going to share some of their reflections, and there'll be an opportunity there to put questions to them. So while you're listening, do pose your questions. We'll save them up until the Q&A and the practice panel right at the end and do our best to answer them all. But it's my pleasure to thank you for joining us and to introduce you to the report author for the Year of the Service Child Voice, Dr. Michael Hall.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, Phil, and welcome to everyone. It's great to be with so many of you this afternoon, and I think it's indicative of really what we were trying to achieve with the projects in the first instance. Now, the Year of the Service Child Voice, as Phil has said, speaks to speaks to the really putting service children's voices and the evidence that we learn from them right at the heart of our work as professionals and as a network. And yeah, it speaks to the mission of the SCIP Alliance in terms of supporting those who support service children. So we identified a sort of key need here, which was to be able to tap into and share the collective experience we know that there's an awful lot of work going on in the sector that is good, that is about listening to children and putting their voices really at the heart of what we do as professionals. And what we've done through this report, or we've attempted to do, is to do that tapping in, not to in a way of making normative recommendations for how work should be carried out. I should say that we're not out to say you should do this. We're really trying to say, here's what happened when some colleagues and professionals in the sector tried this. This is what they learned. This is what they gained from the process. This is how their practice and policy changed as a result. It's also, as I say, not an exhaustive survey of the work in the sector, but we think it is illustrative of a lot of the good work that is happening out there. There was an open call across the Skip Alliance in 2019, the second half, for contributions of examples, and these are the ones that we've drawn together in this report here. I should also make a point that we're not here to stand in judgment of the work that's presented here. As I say, this is about sharing and hopefully of sparking conversations and connections. Again, back to the theme that Phil highlighted, this ability to connect and form connections across the sector, so that we might sort of build up our collective knowledge and experience more readily. But right at the heart of this, the way I see it, is that listening to service children is not a mere technical process of gathering views and responding. It's not necessarily about the nuts and bolts. Right at the heart of this is an ethical imperative. And I've identified, I think, 3 major strands as to why we ought to listen here. Firstly, to affirm and recognise diversity of service children's experiences. Secondly, as an impetus to greater inclusivity in our support that we offer. And thirdly, as an impetus to transformation of the work that we do. So the first point I'd make is that when we consider who a service child is, we are not talking about a singular experience. We're not talking about a kind of a common experience across the whole gamut of the services. We are seeing we can see some commonalities between service children, but the lived experiences, as we all know, are shaped by a whole range of factors, such as family circumstances, the branch of service, the rank and specialist role of the serving parent, geography, geopolitical situations, and also a whole range of factors that are not fundamentally connected to the services. So when we are talking about service children, of course, we are talking about children with a vast diversity of experience. So therefore, we can't claim total understanding of service children just from a few small examples or our own local experiences. So therefore, listening for me is about affirming diversity. It's not just about trying to improve our categories or our ways of labeling. This is about sort of building up our collective knowledge of a vast diversity, but also of recognizing and affirming that diversity and asking how we can value that diversity. Secondly, when we do this, when we affirm diversity and the experiences of service children, we are striving towards greater inclusivity in the work that we do. And listening is central to including, fundamentally. It offers opportunities for enhanced engagement, of a more meaningful participation, and the exercising of agency and voice in the educational support that they experience. Partly this is about a major part of this is about getting beyond our preconceptions and our stereotypes, not reducing service children to our sort of narrow ideas or our preconceptions of what a life might be like. So it's about really engaging with the reality of the lived situation. Secondly, it's listening should help us get beyond a deficit view. You know, we are not here to try and think how to fix children and how to plug gaps in their lives. This is about starting from where children are, what their lived experience is now, the strengths they bring to the table, and as well as their practical challenges and barriers they might experience. But it's not starting from what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. It's starting from where we are and our children's lived experiences and what we can do as professionals as a result. I mean, that's fundamental in identifying and overcoming what may well be structural disadvantages or structural barriers that service children might experience through their educational journeys, and also about enabling a sense of agency in what for some children is a very unstable and uncertain world. I'm reflecting on how an awful lot of children might be feeling right now in lockdown Britain and the uncertainties around there. So there's some parallels here in terms of thinking about the importance of listening. So for me, this listening is a matter of affirming the rights of children. I mean, the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child very clearly identifies the importance of children being able to express views in matters that are related to them. This effective, inclusive listening is a matter of respecting and supporting those fundamental rights. And thirdly, we listen, I think, in order to transform. You know, we transform our structures and our policies and our practices as a result of what children tell us and how we engage with their lived experiences. And we transform ourselves by engaging with fellow professionals in the field. And a lot of the importance, I think, of this work is what we can learn from each other. Now, we know there's a collective wealth of knowledge and understanding in the sector. We see that every time we host an event, or we generate a panel, or a situation such as this. This expertise can be shared, and this is where we see one of our key roles as the Alliance. So this is also about transforming practice in a meaningful way, and particularly, we think, for those who serve smaller numbers of service children, or who engage with service children less regularly through the course of their normal work. It's about seeing what we can learn from each other in collectively enhancing and transforming what we do. So really, it's a question of how do we fit our provision to our children, to their experiences and to their lives, rather than trying to fit our children better to our existing structures and situations. So that, I hope, gives you a sense of the kind of the ethical direction that we're coming from in this. It's not necessarily about the nuts and bolts of listening, although that's a really, really, really key part of it. It's about what can this process of listening and what we've learned collectively as a sector, how does that help us to transform our thinking and therefore our approach to engaging with service children in the round and in the diversity and the reality of the experiences that they have. So I hope that gives you a good foundation of where we're going with this. So I'd like to hand back now to Phil to take us through to the first of our polls.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much, first of all, to Michael, who's just set the scene. When you fulfill your excitement later and download the report from our website, you'll see that Michael has there laid out in some detail those three imperatives, our motivations for wanting to listen in the first place. As I said, the Alliance is principally about partnership. And so we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. And so I'm inviting you now just to engage in the poll, which asks you these questions. You should be able to then on your screen, even if you're on a phone, perhaps there's a button on your phone that you have to click to get access to this, but we're interested in your answers to this question. Why, to date in your work, what is of the three imperatives for listening, which of those stands out to you as the principal motivation that you have had? Have you been listening because you have a commitment to understanding, as Michael said, that there's a diversity in terms of the uniqueness of experiences for service children, and therefore you listen because you want to understand better their unique circumstances? Are you listening because it is key to including them? By understanding and listening, then you're better able to serve their inclusion in your activity? Or are you listening because your intent is to be able to transform as a result of the listening? So I'm just going to leave that open just for a minute or so, allowing people a chance to respond, and then we'll see how you've responded and carry on with the presentation. I'll just give a few more seconds in case others are wanting to vote, but most of you have done that now. If you haven't already, or you've just joined us, I know a few other people have just joined in. We're just asking you to respond to the question, what has been the main reason you've been listening in response to Michael's foundational input? Are you listening because you need to listen because of the diversity of service children's lives? Are you listening because it's an important way of ensuring that service children are included in your activity? Or are you listening because your intent is to transform? So we'll close that poll now and then share with you the results of the poll. And you'll be able to see now that it's a pretty compelling response from our stakeholders. Thanks for responding, so many of you, to that poll. And interesting to see that while I'm sure for many of you, you're challenged to have to pick one when really you're committed to all three of those. But it's really pleasing to see that actually for the sector as a whole, I think this reflects our experience that most people are listening to service children because they care about their lives, and what they care about is how their lives can be changed for the better as a result of listening. What we're going to find, certainly as we listen to Michael now giving his findings from the investigations this year, and also when we listen to the practice panel later, you're going to find that some pretty transformative practice. So I hope you'll benefit from that too. We'll close the poll now and hand back to Michael so that he can share with us the substantive results of our Year of the Service Child Voice. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Phil. So in thinking firstly about the collective examples that we've brought together from the sector, firstly, let's reflect on the sorts of the approaches that are taken by the participants. Firstly, the point I'd make is that, as I said, listening is more than about soliciting views. We are seeing quite a wide range of different sort of approaches, so some more traditional approaches like questionnaires and face-to-face forums to things like creative activities, workshops, filmmaking, and wider consultation exercises as well. So we're seeing quite a broad mix of activities here. There's a mix of more traditional researcher-led activities, say like questionnaires and interviews, and more kind of child-centric approaches like creative hands-on workshops that generate tangible artifacts. And we're also seeing a mix of face-to-face and remote activities. Obviously, this was conducted before the current situation. The first thing I draw from this is there isn't a uniform approach to listening. So that's one of the reasons why I'm hesitant about offering anything like a how-to guide. Rather, this is more about saying, how could we listen? What has happened when we tried listening in certain approaches? Second point I would make for this is that not all of the approaches here required hugely innovative approaches or high investment. We've seen a mixture of quite complex, challenging long-term activities that require that sort of high levels of investment, but also some more simpler and straightforward, or more traditional rather, approaches as well. So I'd be hesitant to say that it's essential that you go for a very complex, innovative approach. in order to generate good and impactful listening. Something we do have to be wary of, though, as listeners, is that as the adults in positions of responsibility, we tend to bear the monopoly on interpretation of what we're hearing. And that's particularly a risk when you have very researcher-driven methods, such as questionnaires and interviews, where the researcher sets the question, sets the tone. Taking more approaches that open up a bit more and allow the child to pursue that, what really concerns them, gives you an opportunity to break out of that. But there's also within this the need to avoid subordinating ourselves to the student voice. So I think what this is about is generating meaningful dialogue in order to produce transformation. So good, effective listening that is meaningful and generates longer term partnership and dialogue is a difficult balance to strike in practice. But what we can see here is quite a wide range of approaches taken by partners in the Alliance. And then we can discern why partners are listening. And again, we've seen a wide variety of individual purposes stated, but we can see generally three broad categories of purpose. Firstly, there's this desire for continuous improvement, and that came through very strongly in the poll, whereby transformation was sort of the major reason. Secondly, there's the question of advocacy, giving and making young people's service children's voices heard more widely and in places that needed to be heard in order to effect transformation. And thirdly, there's this strand of open-ended listening where you have less of a preconception of what you're going to find or what you want to find, but you're simply interested to see, well, what matters to our service children now? What are the big things? What is driving service children's experiences? I should also note that these purposes can very well operate simultaneously. Partners don't just listen for one purpose at the time, generally speaking. Rather, one listening activity can serve multiple ends at the same time. Another thing I'd reflect on here is this kind of the opportunities for more open-ended listening. It's very easy, very tempting, I think, when you're setting up a listening activity to really focus in on a very narrow set of goals that are playing on your mind right now. But to be able to listen in a more open-ended way, sort of letting go a little bit of your own agenda, really gives you the opportunity to open up new avenues of thinking about your practice and thinking about your ways of engaging, your ways of working. So to think in that kind of, listen in that kind of more open-ended way, potentially offers a bit of an antidote to what is raised sometimes as a performance-driven culture, a more authentic way of engaging with that. But as I say, that's in practice, that's a very difficult thing to strike. But drawing on from all of these ideas is what I think are 3 or 4 key principles of effective and impactful listening that are visible across the examples in the report. Firstly, there's this idea of being deliberate, making the effort and putting the resource and the time in to listen. Secondly, being open to new ideas and being open to challenge. Thirdly, being child-centered, in other words, being able to create opportunities for service children to say what matters to them. And fourthly, having this kind of genuine willingness to change from the get-go. So I'll go through each one of these and flesh those out in a little bit of detail. Firstly, I would suggest that effective and impactful listening really does require being deliberate. And then this is fundamentally, this is about making effort. I mean, we cannot listen by osmosis and just assume that the viewpoints will emerge and filter into our perspective. It really does require some deliberate activity in order to engage with the experiences of service children. And quite often that means deliberately addressing service children themselves rather than relying on their experiences emerging through other channels and through other feedback routes. One of the things that strikes us when we talk to service children through our foundational research back in 2016 was this idea that some service children didn't really want to be seen to be different, didn't want to stand out. So creating those spaces where they can talk about their own distinct experiences, their service child experience, in a very deliberate way, I think is crucial. And we've seen that, for example, with our Creative Forces events, which are now being rolled out around the UK. So there's this sense that alongside that, that it's not necessarily the case that children will raise their experiences that are concerning them. I think this goes for many children as well, particularly if for some reason they feel like some kind of outsider or feel marginalized in some way. So actually thinking about where children position themselves in relation to your setting, I think is fairly key here. Now, I mentioned this diversity of approaches in terms of level of resource. Being deliberate does require putting in the resource and the time and the effort and someone with a lead responsibility. As I say, this need not be expensive or a large commitment, but it does need to be done. And there's also opportunities for building that listening into a more systematic and long-term ways to avoid this sense that listening is tokenistic or one-off or just as a short singular exercise. So effective and impactful listening really does require a deliberate approach. Secondly, the examples suggest that this effective and impactful listening really does require openness on the part of the educator or the policymaker. And that's openness, firstly, in terms of to the possibilities that service children might offer in terms of their understanding of their experiences, but also openness to acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that we don't know as much as we might, that there are gaps in our perceptions and our understanding, and we potentially carry presumptions or stereotypes with us when we think about certain groups of children. So it's about letting go of that defensiveness and that kind of sense that we think we have everything sorted. It's also the humility to acknowledge that we cannot totally know and understand service children or any children. We can't totally figure them out. So as our colleagues from the University of Central Lancashire observed, taking a blank page approach is best. Let the children identify what they want to do. Give them that opportunity to turn to them and say, well, what matters to you? So there's this importance of openness that has emerged. Thirdly, effective and impactful listening does need to be child-centred. I struck on the difficulty of striking that balance between, as a professional, having those responsibilities, not just to your children, but to your wider set of stakeholders here. But what certainly the example from North Yorkshire points out is that the having the voice right at the centre of our efforts to support children is absolutely imperative. The other thing with that is, as adults, we cannot necessarily decide from the face of it what sort of views matter, what sort of perspectives are important here and which are irrelevant necessarily. I mean, if you take the issue of how do you understand engagement, children's engagement in learning, for instance, is that purely a matter of lesson content? So do you purely engage in views about lesson content, or could other factors such as the physical school environment actually make a difference? So it's avoiding this kind of sense that we know what the fundamental issues are. We have to remain sort of able to be led by children to explore and unpack what is going on in our settings or our services. And in that's the major way in which we can genuinely and openly turn to children and engage with their perspectives, and in a meaningful way that generates dialogue. So the fourth real key point here is that effective and impactful listening requires a genuine willingness to change practice and policy. Now, what I mean by that is that the mere act of listening here isn't enough. It's not just enough to gather views, think about and respond. Nor is it sufficient to listen in order to validate the approaches that we've taken or the strategy that we've embarked upon, although that listening might actually validate the approach you've taken. Rather, when I say a genuine willingness to change, this is about starting from the presumption that if you're going to go and engage in an act of listening, that things are going to change as a result. So starting with that presumption, that's even before you know what they're going to say. So the examples you see here are genuinely about saying, we think there may be some changes required in what we do and our policies and our practices in someone else's, in the structural environment, for example. So starting with that assumption, I think, is pretty key. Now, that's not a comfortable process. If you're in a position of leadership, governance of an institution, for instance, you have an awful lot that you need to ensure that you deliver, not all of which are necessarily the agendas of the children that you're working for. But it does mean, in that sense, that some non-negotiables may need to be negotiated. You may need to put things on the table that you had genuinely not thought about as being a challenge. And again, as I say, I don't try to pretend that this is an easy task. I've been a school governor, so I know that I've got some insight into the sort of the balance, the strategic challenges and the balances that have to be drawn. But starting from the presumption that if you're going to listen, you're probably going to do something differently, and you're going to show that that change is happening, is actually fairly fundamental here. It's about avoiding this sense that listening is tokenistic, that it's about a kind of a tick box approach and so forth. And again, it's not necessarily a comfortable process. It's about being able to expose yourself to that potential to be challenged. So what do we draw from this that can be operationalized? We've identified, coming out of these principles and these examples, 5 sort of major recommendations, which we've tried to write in a way that is inclusive to as many and broad a range of stakeholders as possible. I find myself occasionally slipping back into the language of schools, occasionally, because actually that's my experience. But in the way we've framed the recommendations in the report, I would hope that there's something in there for everyone. Firstly, we'd urge all stakeholders, whatever sector, whatever responsibility, to reflect on those 4 key principles and think, well, how does that help us rethink our thinking, in a way, if that's not too much thinking involved. It's about keeping at the level of the principles here, is what we're saying, not making normative recommendations for the change of practice, because actually we recognize that practice is heavily contextual. It's very difficult to transplant practice from one context to another and say that'll work. So we've deliberately avoided that sort of approach. But think about those 4 principles that have emerged, and what does that say to the way in which we all engage with service children. Secondly, we recognise that professionals and our colleagues are at very different stages of their journeys in supporting service children. We know there are those with very, very well-developed practices and those with somewhat, shall I say, less well-developed practice. Those with well-developed practices, we encourage to think, how can we share? How can you how can we make that embedded knowledge spread out and generate impacts across the sector? Thirdly, if you're less far along that journey, well, how can you start to better engage service children? What can we draw from more experienced colleagues? So those 2 recommendations really go hand in hand in a way. Fourthly, we've suggested that stakeholders should seek opportunities to listen in partnership with others, partly about sharing experience and resource, but also about helping to spread that impact of listening beyond one setting. So having stakeholders from 2 different sectors partner up to engage more widely gives you greater opportunity for dialogue between organisations as well as with our service children. And finally, we should be thinking about developing robust and systematic ways of capturing service children's voices. Now, by that, I don't mean working out the key way of listening to service children. It's about really, for example, thinking about ways in which you can build listening into your regular work. So creating regular opportunities to engage and listen and transform, but also drawing in the evidence of what's going on in the sector and thinking about how things could possibly work in your setting. So drawing on the evidence that's out there. And in that way, we develop more robust and more systematic practice as well. And hopefully exercises such as this and the work that the Alliance and the partners do will support that kind of development. So those are really the major findings from the report. So we go into more detail, so please do urge you to download and access the report afterwards. But I hope that's given you a good sense of where we've been going with this approach and what we've derived from this, and that it's been an informative overview. So at this point, can I hand back to Phil, please?
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing the fascinating findings of our work in the Year of the Service Child Voice. I hope you can see that it's been fascinating for us to see the great diversity and the depth of listening that's been going on. But I have to say my personal thanks to Michael for making sense of that diversity in ways that are so easy to engage with. So you've got hopefully some really simple takeaways. You know that you're going to go away and as much as you can, if you're not already, or enhance your commitment to be deliberate, to be open, to be child-centered, and to be willing to change. We are going to now make a transition into a second poll. I won't launch the poll yet, just explain what's going to happen next. We're going to ask you to respond to this poll. I'm aware now, as I wasn't before, that if you're looking on YouTube, sorry, you don't see the results of the poll, so I shall read out those results and you'll be able to at least know what the results were. After that, we're going to have an opportunity for you to put some questions to Michael about the report, the findings that he's identified in response to the listening that we've been doing, listening to you about your listening practices. So please do that. I can see people are asking questions in the Q&A. If you go into the Q&A section and someone's already raised the question that's broadly in the area you're interested in, please just give it a little tick. And rather than us having loads of questions to look through, we'll know that that one's a very popular one. I can see that some of those questions are not about the listening practices, some of them are, but some of them are more about wider practice, about engaging with and supporting service children. And it might be that Michael will be able to share some responses to those where there is research to give us some insights. I'll do my best to respond to some of those as well that I can see we might do. But also, I'm really pleased that the panelists that we've been able to gather today are people who are working with service children in practical situations, face-to-face, developing resources, listening projects, and supporting them to make good and confident transitions. So we've got a range of expertise and experience on the panel as well, and some of those might be well placed to answer some of your questions. So please pose those. And in a minute, I'll invite my colleague Kath Lawrence, who's the head of operations at Skip Alliance and has been busy in the background making sure all this works. She'll just curate a few of those questions to put to Michael and then the panel as well, if we need to do that. While I've been talking, you've probably been reading this question. So we'll launch the poll now and give you an opportunity just to reflect on what you've heard. We're asking you, which of the 4 principles would be your priority for development? We're really interested to know, because we're interested in the action that will take place as a result of the work that we do, where we might want to focus our attention in future. So if you've been listening to Michael and thinking that you need to be doing more about being deliberate, that actually you're at the point where what we need to be doing is actually just making deliberate effort, or perhaps you are doing some listening, but that's challenged you to think about the way you approach it, then it might be that being deliberate will be a priority for you. It might be that being open is a priority, that your listening practices, the way that you've been going about them, have been very much very bounded, and therefore not necessarily open to the range of different perspectives and views you might have, and you want to prioritize that and find and develop ways to do that better in future. So you'll be selecting be open. It could be that a priority for you is being child-centered, that actually you've been challenged by some of the things that Michael's been sharing about how it's very easy for us to set the questions, for us to set the tone, for us to set the boundaries of the work that we're doing, instead of letting children themselves define the agenda and raise the issues and areas of concern and priorities that they have in their lived experience. And that might be a priority for you, so you can select that one. Or fourthly, it could be that a lot of your listening, as you've been reflecting on what Michael's been sharing, has been about listening to understand or listening to advocate in some ways, and less about the change that you're going to achieve as a result of the listening that you've been doing, in which case you'll be selecting be willing to change. I'm just going to leave that poll open for a few more seconds and be quiet to let you have a think about that, and then I'll come back to share with you the results. In the meantime, please do share any questions you've got for Michael in the Q&A section. Okay, most of you have responded to that. So we'll end the poll now and reflect together on the results. Like I said, I know some of you aren't able to see those results if you're watching on YouTube, so I'll just share those now. So which of the 4 principles would be your priority for development? 11% of you have responded with be deliberate, and only 5% with be open. 52% of you responded with be child-centered, which is far and above the largest number, and 31%, a third of you, have responded with be willing to change. I'm not surprised by that, because actually as I was listening, even though I've been involved in the project for the entirety of the year and have been involved in reflecting on the results as Michael's formed the report, those are the 2 areas that have been the most challenged to me. We're certainly committed to the change that we want to see, because that was our starting point. But being challenged about the genuineness with which we're listening is a really uncomfortable one. In fact, Michael used the word uncomfortable when he was describing this particular principle, because it's about saying we as adults need to let go of some of the control. We as adults have to say, while we have a responsibility, and this is the tension that Michael referred to, while we have a responsibility to children, we don't have all the answers, and their experience is their own. And the most genuine response that we can make to them is to let them not only respond to the questions we ask, but set their own questions. So I'm not surprised that that has come out as the top one. And I'm really pleased as well that as a result of the report and the responses that we've had to date, I'm confident that we shall do a lot of very important soul searching in the coming days and weeks about how in the coming year we'll respond ourselves as an alliance to the Year of the Service Child Voice. And one thing I certainly have in mind is a follow-up project that will allow us to explore with you as allies throughout the UK where we can see these practices around being deliberate, being open, being child-centered and being willing change best evidenced. And we'll do our best to facilitate sharing of that good practice, as well as developing then the resources and guidance that you need in order to do a better job in any of those that you want to. So thank you very, very much for that, for responding and sharing your views. Right, we have the opportunity now to hear from you in regards to the questions you might have for Michael. This is where I'm very pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, Kath Lawrence, the Head of Operations at the Skip Alliance, who's been looking at the questions and is going to pose a couple of those to us, those that have been most popular. Like I said, some of those will be pertinent, particularly to Michael now in response to the report, and there may be others that we'll come back to for the panel later. But over to you, Kath. What's been most pressing on our delegates' minds?
Hi everyone. I think there's a good theme around university and access and outreach teams. I think we've got quite a few people from that sector here, and people are wondering how it would be best to engage with service children. Michael, I was wondering what's the most striking thing, the most striking example of what people learned from young people about the context for their lives, something that would help these access and participation teams to think about the best way to engage with young people from this background?
I think what I'd suggest in that is your starting point is to understand the schools and the environment and the locale in which you work, where your priorities are. I've tried to make a point a few times that we're not talking about children with a universal set of experiences that can be generalized very easily from one context and locality to another. And quite often you're also talking about children who also experience a whole wide range of things that are not service related as well. So in some ways, a lot of what matters to service children in transition to higher education will be shared by their non-service peers as well. I think, but the other part of that is actually, as I say, understanding the situations that your local schools are in. I mean, we developed a mapping tool on the Skip Alliance website to try and get a feel for the local distribution of service children across the piece. So that's one way of starting to understand the distributions of service children, for instance. Are you dealing with schools with small concentrations of larger numbers of service children, say if you have a military installation nearby in your patch, or are you dealing with almost half of the schools in England, for instance, that have only 1 or 2 service children on roll? Are you dealing with small numbers, relatively well distributed? So I think the key piece of advice is to talk to your schools, ask them the question, how many service children do you have? What are you finding out from engaging with them? Where are you where is that school in their journeys? And I think that sort of is about building up that kind of partnership response, partnership approach with the context of the school. So very difficult to generalize, I would say, but I would suggest that's the starting point, is understand the school context.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think we've also got questions around how we can help teaching staff in schools understand the context for service children. I think that we may have some insight on that from our panelists later. But there's also questions around HE students and how we engage with those. I don't know whether you can say a little bit about whether the findings shed any light on that.
Not directly from the findings, however, what we've seen from our own experience in working with service children at the University of Winchester is a lot of the challenges about actually opening up those lines of communication and saying, we recognise you as a service child, come and talk to us. I think what we don't yet have is systematic sector-wide understanding of who is a service child. We know more and more institutions are building that into their data collection and are committing to doing that in the as a matter of course as part of their access and participation plans, for instance. So this is about kind of, I think, a strategic approach as an institution to say, how are we going to identify our students and their experiences, and what opportunities are we creating for them to come forward and engage. But I think fundamentally is about sending the message that we recognise that you're there, and then creating those spaces, the deliberate spaces to try and engage.
I think we've got time for one more if there is anything, Kath, for Michael, but if they're more likely to be for the panel, then we'll move on.
Well, Michael might be able to say a little bit about how perhaps the report can help people to put together, when people are putting together funding bids for projects they might be considering, how might the report that you've pulled together help with that?
Sure. I think first and foremost, they're great selections of examples of work that are that are underway in the sector and what has been derived by those organisations. So firstly, they're a source of evidence, I think, that you can use to underpin and say, well, hang on, this organisation did this as part of their approach. So that's the justification for trying something like this in our bid, for example. Secondly, it gives those organisations some visibility as well. So it's an opportunity, I think, to try and connect with some of those who are doing some very visible practice in the field as well. So there's the opportunity really to start building up your connections, I think, as a result. But also it's a way of trying to provide a bit of grounded thinking to the way you frame your approach and your pitch. I think I saw a question about, I think, about promoting good use of funding as a result as well. And again, I think drawing on this plus the whole wider range of evidence that's out there from a whole number of organisations in the field, I think is really key to grounding those bids and demonstrating that they are informed by real world practice.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Kath, for posing those questions, and thank you to you delegates for sharing them. You've posed many more than we have time to answer. I think I said earlier, and I'll say again now, that we will look through those later and do our best to respond after the event if we haven't been able to during the event today. But I'm really pleased to be able to, I'm very thankful to be able to move on to our panel section, which we'll hear from 3 of the organisations that whose work is featured in the report. And they are Moira Leslie from the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, great friends of the Alliance, pioneers certainly in Scotland, but also across the UK in terms of the setting up of hubs, the second hub, I think, to be set up for the Alliance, and they partner with the university in Scotland to do so. Millie Taylor leads the service SSE Cymru, the Service Children Support project in Wales, and have just this year launched Skip Alliance Hub with partners in the University of South Wales with Dr. Ross Hall there. So we're very thankful to Millie and to Ross for that. And Louisa Dobson, I think, has the honour of being the pioneer setting up the first hub, Skip Alliance Hub, and is based in Yorkshire at Future High, the OFS funded Uni Connect partnership in that part of the country. So thank you to you 3. I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to spend 2 minutes just reflecting on the practice of theirs that is included in the report. Now that they've seen how their practice features alongside other practice in the report and the principles that are highlighted, what jumps out to them about their own practice as they look back when thinking about the principles? So I'm going to start with Moira first of all and ask you, Moira, would you share your reflections now on those 4 principles and where you've seen your work focusing in response to those? Thanks very much, Moira. I think you'll need to unmute your video, Moira.
Oh, it's unmuted. Okay, there we are. Thanks, Phil. The Royal Caledonian Education Trust is Scotland's Armed Forces Children's Charity, so therefore Youth Voice is nothing new to us, and it's actually central to everything we do. But for the purposes of this project and the report, we wanted to highlight a more recent development of our work, and it's the Youth Participation Project. The Youth Participation Project has already created 7 local forums across Scotland, each with approximately 6 members and each with their own local action plans. Representatives from these forums feed into the National Forum, which is the Military Youth Voice Scotland, who meet regularly and have already established 3 residential events and have participated in 2 national conferences. And thinking about the 4 principles which Michael has actually highlighted today, I think RCET's work touches on all 4, but the Youth Participation Project focuses more definitely on 2, and that is firstly the child-led approach, because my colleague Nina Collins, who is the project manager, is the first to say, although she manages a project and facilitates a project, it is actually the children themselves who actually own the projects and own the forums and own the agenda for what they're doing. The second is a genuine willingness to transform practice and policy. The youth voices have already influenced RCET's prioritisation of our policies and position statements, but the impact goes beyond RCET. And a very recent example is the fact that there is a motion being put to the Scottish Parliament to discuss armed forces youngsters. And this is a direct result of what these young people are saying through the national forums. What I'm struck with continually is the apparent lack of understanding and challenges, despite all the work that's going on by the movers and shakers at national level. Adults are not always good at active listening, but our young people have clear ideas of what is important to them and what needs to be done for these ideas to be supported and turned into real action. So I think educators, policymakers, decision makers, movers and shakers all need to make a commitment to actually not only creating opportunities for the youngsters to have their voices heard, not only listening to what they're saying, but to actually really stopping to hear what's being said and then translating that into action. Listening to young people, as Michael has said, demands commitment, skill, time, hard work, and all are evidenced in our youth participation project. I believe we have still got an awful lot to learn, but we'll only do that by actually listening to the experts, and these are the young people themselves. Thanks, Phil.
That's really kind, Moira. Thank you so much for demonstrating what's possible when you listen so genuinely to young people and let them set the agenda. Let's move on then to Millie, bringing a context from Wales. We're very pleased to hear from you, Millie.
Thank you very much. Yeah, firstly, I'd just like to say how lovely it is to see so many people involved in today's virtual event. It's new to us all, but I'm personally very pleased to kind of be able to ignore the fact that there's actually so many people and pretend that I'm just speaking to a handful. It certainly makes it a little bit easier to deliver my thoughts on the report that was been shared with me recently. I was pleased to be involved. The SSE Cymru programme was very pleased to be one of the examples included within the report, and certainly my initial thoughts, I know you're already excited to get a copy of that at the end of today's event, is the variety of examples that are included. We were really pleased with how we conducted our project, but it was really, really lovely and positive to see such a variety of styles and themes, as indicated by Michael already. With regard to the 4 principles discussed today, regarding be deliberate, and so basically I'm going to share my thoughts on how our project relates to these 4 principles. So being deliberate, with our project, we were clear with the themes that we wanted to collect evidence on. We were clear about the kind of conversations that we wanted to have with our service children. We utilised the subject matter experts in Wales and across the UK to identify what those themes should be. But leading on to the second principle with regards to being open, it certainly was a key element of our discussion groups with service children, was the importance of being open and creating opportunities for service children to share openly about their thoughts and their feelings, which can be really challenging. My colleague Sarah, who is our school and community engagement officer, actually conducted the discussion groups with the service children, which was fantastic because her experience working in education as a teacher really enabled her and gave her the right skill set to be able to openly have those conversations with the children, giving them time to respond. Which we saw some fantastic responses from the children, and particularly the older service children that were able, which really impressed me particularly, was their ability to reflect on their views and their experiences. And so as they got older, they could see how their experiences earlier on in their education would have impacted them currently and in their future. And I think that was really, really interesting for us. We certainly tried to establish a child-centered approach, and that was enabled because of Sarah's experience in working with children. She was able to give them the floor and facilitate that communication, which was really key. And then finally, with regards to a willingness to change, SSE Cymru is focused on gathering evidence and ensuring that can lead on to impact in the work that we do and the policy that we can impact, working with Welsh Government and working through the Skip Alliance and with the MOD as well. So yes, and then thank you ever so much. I think that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Millie. That's great. Lastly, then to you, Louisa.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm like Millie and Moira, really pleased to be able to talk to you this afternoon about a project that I'm actually personally quite proud of. Phil, thank you for that first shout out. I was, from my perspective, so happy when I first started working with Future High. To have the Skip Alliance there to help me navigate how to work with service children, and it was a real pleasure for me to meet you so early on in my own career, and hopefully actually I've seen that there are a few new people on the chat that are new to outreach, and hopefully my experiences can help you to reflect on what you would like to do yourselves. So as I said, I'm an outreach hub officer for Future High, and the project I'd like to quickly tell you about, which is in the report, is called Lost in Translation, which we delivered in Colburn, which is in Catterick Garrison in North Yorkshire, and we delivered this across the summer of last year. And it was delivered actually in a youth club setting to young people who were aged between around 14 to 19 years old. And the reason for the project was that often my colleagues and I, we hear young people talk about the aspirations they have for their future, and sometimes they seem to be misunderstood or misheard by adults. So the aim of our project was to develop a film through a series of workshops to essentially give positive social identities for young people, and also improve social cohesion within their wider community. So retrospectively, I've looked at how our project touched on all four of the principles that Michael has shared with us this afternoon. First of all, to be deliberate, we asked a local social enterprise company called Inspired Youth to deliver the workshops, and they produced the final film for us. And it was obviously really important that the project produced something at the end of an excellent quality, but also that it truly reflected what the young people wanted to say. And so of course Inspired Youth were the people to do that for us. And obviously, to be deliberate, you might think that you need to have a clear plan of activity, start, finish, this is exactly what I'm going to do. But of course that is true, but in reality sometimes when you're working with young people, you have to constantly reevaluate what you're doing and how you're doing, and adapt to what can sometimes be challenging behaviour. You don't know what you're going to necessarily come up to when you're actually there in front of the children. So actually being able to adapt, willingness to listen to what they needed from us, and then still get to the end result, but actually perhaps do it a bit differently, I think was really, really important to actually get to the end, the final film that we wanted. Secondly, the goal of the project was to be open with our young people. Particularly, it was about challenging stereotypes which are ingrained about, you know, challenging behaviours, troubled backgrounds, and actually we wanted to challenge that, and we wanted the young people to actually come up with the topics they wanted to discuss and actually co-produce that final film. So you really got a sense of who they were. And for example, one of the things that I found interesting, that they were really passionate about veterans living in Catterick, and I don't know why I didn't think that that would be something that they thought about, but they were so passionate, and that was one thing that I picked up that was really interesting. Thirdly, being child-centred, of course, it was really important that the young people felt that they were in the driving seat. So we didn't prompt them, we allowed them to be honest, even if what they said was negative, because then it really felt honest. And the final script of our film was taken from what the young people said. Finally, we encouraged, of course, a willingness to change, and we did this by launching the film at a local cinema in Catterick Garrison, kindly provided by Empire Cinemas, free of charge, which was amazing, popcorn for everyone, in December of last year. And we invited local policymakers, youth workers, teachers, the parents, the children themselves, and also representatives from the army came to see the film. And what I think was the most important thing there was how the young people were able to witness their voice being heard by those in influential positions of power. And it was an extremely positive experience for them that gave them, I think, a real sense of pride and that actually achieved something. It was well received at the actual launch, and I think that they were really struck that young people are not used, those young people particularly, are not used to being listened to. So they sat at the back of the cinema, they were there, and I think they were blown away, by how many people turned up and actually listened to this, watched this video, but also that it was potentially the first time, I think, that they had heard people in authority say such positive things about them as a group and actually respond straight away to what they had been saying in that film. It is available to watch, and Michael has put that link for the film in the report, so please when you do download that report, go away and access that link on YouTube and watch the film and let us know what you think.
Thanks very much, Louisa, and again to Millie and Moira for sharing diverse examples of some really genuine listening. I've been looking over the Q&A. Thank you for submitting questions. Some of these are things that we'll follow up on later. I think I can see, for example, colleagues at University of Central Lancashire asking us about using our eyes as well as our ears. My first impression is that we probably come to you for some guidance on that, because your example, the example that we've included in the report from you, it probably stands out as an exceptional expression of how we can use art and other creative means to allow children themselves to do the listening and then tell us what we should be hearing. So I can't say much more than that live, certainly. And also somebody else asking about whether or not we would be happy to share the attendee list. So, which I guess is in response to the fact that there's been so much good networking going on while you've also been listening. We haven't asked people for permission to do that, but I'm quite happy that with a follow-up email to this to you, we will ask people for their permission to do that. And if they explicitly give us permission, I think we'll be able to then collate an attendee list and share that with you. So that will be dependent on whether or not you are happy for us to share with you. But there have been some other interesting questions about how we go about addressing some of the challenges that service children face. One of the ones that stands out to me is about the practices of engaging, of what support is available to help teachers to go about effectively supporting young people. I'll say one thing about that, which is that there are resources on our website, and also within the Q&A, some of those have been responded to already by other people in the network. So I'm great that that's been able to happen. We're also in the process of piloting a Thriving Lives Toolkit, the result of some research undertaken by the University of Derby, the International Centre for Guidance Studies. I think you're listening as well, which identified 7 features of effective practice for school support. That's being piloted at the moment by UniConnect partners, and will be launched at our conference on the 20th of October. So there's one answer to that question. But let me just put that to you. I know that each of you, Moira, Millie and Louisa, will have some experience of that. Moira's works often with schools providing guidance and support, and you might be able to say something, Moira, about how to go about doing that well. But Millie, I know, provides direct support to schools as well, and Louisa works with schools from a different context. So I'll offer you each the opportunity just to say something in response to the question, how do we go about helping schools to do a good job of supporting service children? We'll start with you, Moira.
Okay, well, as you've said, staff development and training is very much part of my work. And what I find when I do go to schools for training is that there's not a lack of willingness to support these youngsters. There's perhaps just a lack of confidence in knowing what to do and which strategies actually to deploy. So raising awareness is still very important. I mean, basic raising awareness is very important, but they also move very quickly on to staff actually ask for resources, which you've mentioned already, Phil, and there are a wealth of resources out there to tap into, but also just basic strategies to use in the classroom and in the school to support the youngsters. But what I would say is there is a willingness, but there's a lack of confidence, which we need to break down, hopefully through the Thriving Lives toolkit, hopefully with the work that we're doing in Scotland, creating professional development modules, not just for academics, but for any professionals. So there are resources to tap into, and I would just urge schools to just ask, don't be frightened to ask for help.
That's really kind of you. And I think given the interest there's been in this theme, I can see that we might be running some future webinars on particularly on support for schools and drawing on some of your experience again. I'll ask Millie the same question. What's your experience been in terms of supporting schools to access resources for yourselves and for others who want to support schools, but also just helping them improve their practice?
Yes, I certainly would agree with Moira that there's definitely a willingness in the schools to want to engage with the armed forces community, with service children, and to have a better understanding their experiences so that they can support service children in the best possible way. Unfortunately, a lot of the challenges we find in the schools is the capacity that they actually have, the time and sometimes the cost of actually dedicating so many time or resources to developing tools or projects that, or at the time even spending with service children to develop that that kind of support and to embed it within the school as well. Certainly with SSE, in SSE Cymru and in Wales, we're really focused on embedding good practice when it comes to any projects that are funded or not funded, as it might be, so that there is a lasting impact within the school, and also sharing that good practice. So the Thriving Lives toolkit that's being developed by Skip is really exciting, and that will be a fantastic resource for schools to be able to use to, one, develop their knowledge, and two, develop a evidence-based tool that will help them to embed good practice. I've also, within the comments, the Q&A typey thing, where that question was posed, I have sent a link to the SSE Cymru toolkit that we've launched recently, actually within in the past few months. It is a guide that we've developed for Wales. However, if you ignore the Education in Wales section, if you're somewhere else, then a lot of the content is relevant for you as well. And alongside that toolkit, we've developed a series of good practice examples and case studies. I think we've got 14 or 15 on our website now, all focusing on different areas such as funding or data collection, for example, and also a series of tools. I think we've got about 14 or 15 tools on the website as well at the minute that we've developed with schools that have experience working with children, so that they can share their experience and their knowledge with others. So there's lots there, like we've already said, there are lots of tools, lots of resources, but it's about figuring out where to access those. But I'm certainly happy to have conversations with schools as much as possible to help them understand that. And then just one final point I have is about, yes, staffing is the one thing that we found in our evidence. Having staff in schools to dedicate their time and resources to support and service children is really key. So for any funding applications, we're certainly seeing more and more schools applying for staff so that they can have a specific person there to support the service children.
Thanks, Millie. Louisa, you have a different perspective from Moira and Millie as well, wanting to engage with schools in relation to progress to higher education. What would you have to add?
Particularly looking at this particular group, of course, if you have somewhere like Catterick Garrison on your doorstep, then you might have a completely different relationship with the school about working with this group that you might do in other areas. Even in North Yorkshire, we have schools where there might only be 1 or 2 pupils, so the relationship there is different. And from speaking from the perspective, I think, from outreach teams, we might approach those schools differently. If we as an outreach team want to do some work with service children, then we might be mapping and looking at different schools. We want to try where we can to include all schools and all service children, not just those where there are lots of service children, because of course they might have different levels of support and understanding of how to support in school as well. So I know, and as lots of colleagues will know, that can be a challenge of how to actually get through to those schools. I actually want to, if I was going to give a piece of advice, I would say that these, Phil mentioned early on that there are these Skip Alliance hubs that are across the whole of England. So of course you've got Moira and Millie for a Scottish and Welsh perspective, but also in England we have these hubs. And if you are a school or indeed an outreach team who fit into any of those hubs, please contact the lead. For me, I am the North Yorkshire, well, actually the North East and Yorkshire hub lead. So if you go on the Skip Alliance website and you find all of those hubs, do contact your local one. I would love to hear from anyone in my patch, and we can give you sort of more helpful knowledge about the patch and working with service children in our patch from both the perspective of being in school and being in an outreach team to help you start to work out how to do that approach and maybe give you a few tips.
That's really kind, Louisa, and thank you to Moira and Millie. Sorry we've run out of time to be able to give any more responses. There are lots of questions, and thanks also to others who are answering each other's questions in the chat. That's been fantastic, and in the Q&A. I'm really pleased about that, because one of the main things I said that the Alliance is keen to do is to enable connection. So you can expect more events like this in the future, I'm sure. We've got just a few minutes for us to close. I first of all want to just say a really big thank you to Dr. Michael Hall for his fantastic work on the report, to Moira Leslie from the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, Milia Taylor at SSE Cymru, and Louisa Dobson at Future High in Yorkshire and the North East for their work. But most of all, to all those whose work has been featured and others who haven't, as well as all of you who are just getting on and doing this listening. I'm really pleased as well to be able to close by saying a few things about the fact that this is not the end, but this is a beginning. On the screen in front of you, you should be able to see a few things that I think are worth your attention. One thing is just to say that today was to be our conference, which has been postponed now to the 20th of October, in the hope that we'll be able to do that face-to-face. So in the meantime, certainly that is our plan. If things have to change, then we'll change that again. But please do go ahead and book. Don't be worried about booking, and then if it doesn't go ahead, obviously we'll be able to refund you if that becomes necessary. But do go ahead and book so that we can plan appropriately for the scale of operation we need to make for the 20th of October, when we'll be launching the Thriving Lives Toolkit that you've heard much about, as well as enhancements to the map, which you can find online and play about with and tell us what you would like to improve on it. I'd also like to give out our huge thanks to the collaboration of UniConnect partnerships, including the Next Step Southwest, the Wessex Inspiration Network, HEON in Surrey, the Southern Universities Network, Higher Horizons, and Future High, who've been collaborating to fund and develop and test and lead the evaluation for the Thriving Lives Toolkit, the map, and supporting CPD. And thanks also to North Yorkshire and to Matt Blyton, who've been leading on that particular element. So thank you to those who are the best expression of the Alliance, because you have collectively come together to answer a direct question that's been asked. How do we find service children? What can we do? Who can help me? And those resources are all designed to respond to that question. So I'm really pleased to be able to finish with encouraging you to take advantage of that. A colleague of mine is going to place in the chat a link to the report, which is now live on our website. So if you want to, when this is over, you can just click that link in the chat. If you've got other things to go on to or you can't because you're on YouTube, then don't worry. We shall be emailing you in the next few minutes with a link to the report on the website so that you can find that, download and read at your leisure. Please do so, and please encourage others to come to the website and download the report as well. Like I said, this is the start of something rather than the end. So we're really looking forward to finding ways of encouraging your listening and helping you to enhance your listening over the coming year. It's also the case that we'd like to know how you found this event. And to that end, when we close end the broadcast, there's a link to an evaluation. So please just take a few minutes to tell us how this has gone in terms of its content and format. Has the technology worked? We'd love to improve that in future, but we'll also put the evaluation link in the email that we send as well. So it only remains to me to say thanks again to all of those who've contributed today. Thank you to you who've listened, and thank you to the allies throughout the UK and beyond who make the Alliance what it is. Thank you.